Hi folks, the purpose of this brief mini lecture is to go a little more in depth with the idea of what a qualifier is and how you can use it to create a neutral, unbiased voice in your paper. Now the particular assignment that you've been given is to, for a general purpose, only inform and to educate your audience, and your audience is a highly educated, scholarly, and academic one. So we're only presenting the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how on the topic, and we're presenting this information in much the same way that a journalist would. If I were watching a newscast, for instance, and I were looking at a journalist who was doing this, who was only giving us the information as an audience and allowing us to make a decision about it, then I should never really have a clue about how this journalist might actually feel about the topic as an individual and what their personal opinion might be. So that's the stance and the approach that we're going to take in your academic research paper this term. And I've mentioned this a little bit to you before. And in the qualifying statements, thesis statements video, I talked about this briefly, but here we're going to go into this in a little more depth. So why remain neutral? Again, as I sort of just alluded to, what you want to do is present your information in a way in which your audience doesn't really know and understand what your own personal view on this topic is. Our goal is not to argue or take a stance on the topic. Our goal is only to inform and educate. So what we're doing is we're showing our reader the information that we found, and we're allowing them to make their own judgments about it and form their own opinions. So let's take a look at a statement that might appear in a research paper. Let's take a look at this sentence here. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was, above all else, a televised drama. Now, if this sentence were to appear in your paper, would this statement come across as your opinion, or would it come across as the opinion of a neutral and unbiased source? It would likely come across as your own opinion. It would appear that you were taking a stance on the issue of the civil rights movement, and you were saying it was a televised drama. Well, that's taking a position, and you don't really want to do that. So what we need to do is make this statement neutral. Well, how can we do that? Well, as briefly mentioned when we discussed, qualifying thesis statements, what you need to do is add a qualifier somehow into this statement that it then conveys the ideas in a neutral and unbiased way. So here, since we're sort of talking about a historical event, we can add many historians feel that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s was, above all else, a televised drama. So with this statement now, when your reader comes across this in your paper, would they believe this is your individual personal opinion, or now would they believe this were the opinion of a large group of people? So obviously they would believe it was the opinion of a large group. So now what you're doing is you're presenting this information to them in a very broad, neutral, unbiased way, and now this comes across as the opinion of a broad group. Now often students will ask me, but well, who are these many historians? Well, remember, one of the things you have to do in your research paper is you're going to have to stop at times and make connections between your sources and connect all of these ideas in your paper back to your thesis statement. So these many historians that you mention here are really all the other sources that you've gathered and included in your research paper. So let's look at another bigger example and longer example of how we would do this. Notice the pieces here in red. Many historians feel that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s was, above all else, a televised drama. Carl Banks agrees, noting that the same economy of mass consumption that had emphasized the distribution of goods and services as the fundamental characteristic of economic life also distributed one particularly critical good, the television, to almost every home. He argues television supported itself as a means of advertising, but it had a cultural force beyond stimulating desires for products. Simply put, Banks claims it became a medium for presenting local civil rights struggles to the nation as a whole. Now, what you'll notice here is that there is one statement that takes information and presents it in a very broad, neutral, unbiased way, but the other is attributing this idea to a very specific individual. The first sentence there, we could imagine that this were a paragraph in a paper, and the first sentence at the top there, right here, this uses a qualifier, so many historians feel. Now we could imagine that this were a paragraph in a paper and this first sentence were the topic sentence of that particular paragraph. Then it appears that what this writer has done then has taken the remainder of the ideas in this paragraph, beginning with Carl Banks agrees here, and given us some very specific evidence and support to show that this is true, that this first sentence, this topic sentence is true. But what's the difference between many historians feel and Carl Banks agrees? Well, there's a big one. Carl Banks agrees and he argues those other items in red there, for instance. These are called signal phrases. And signal phrases signal to the remainder, signal to your reader that what's about to follow in those sentences is, an idea that specifically belongs to Carl Banks. These signal phrases and qualifiers are really, really important. Let me show you why. If you had this particular paragraph in your paper here, as a reader, I would not understand exactly where these ideas were coming from. For instance, if you compare this to the last example that I just gave you, that first sentence there, when I read it, I would assume, hey, this is the writer of this paper's idea. Same with the remainder of those particular sentences. There's no signal phrase there, so I don't understand that the ideas are actually coming from Carl Banks. Now, if they had, and this paragraph were in your paper, you would have two problems. The first one is that first sentence where you're actually using your voice, and actually all this would come across as your opinion. And remember, the general purpose of this paper is only to inform, so that would be one way that this would be incorrect. But the bigger and more important one would be that you had actually used information from a source and you had presented it as your own here, because you didn't use a signal phrase and you didn't cite it either, so you didn't show that this information came from Carl Banks. So what you're doing is you're taking Carl Banks' ideas, actually you're stealing them, and you're presenting them as your own, because your name's going to be at the top of this paper. So qualifiers and signal phrases are very important. Now we'll get to the specifics of how we cite all of this a little bit later, but understand that when information comes from a source, it must be cited. But let me show you the importance of qualifiers and signal phrases. They signal to the reader what information belongs to whom and where it came from. So let's look at this example here, and it really pretty much mostly just shows you qualifiers and signal phrases. Now the signal phrases are in red and the qualifiers here are in yellow. In her article, Racial Justice, Scenes from Daily Life, Mary Jones, director of the NAACP, explains that. And then I have a quote inside of the quotation marks there. So that's a quote from Mary Jones. She points out, and then I have some information that follows that that's being paraphrased. And I know it's being paraphrased because, or summarized, because I don't see quotation marks there, but I see the signal phrase, so I know that it is coming from a source by Mary Jones. Immediately following that, I see she relates and more information, and then she argues and more information. Then in yellow, I see many social scientists, however, disagree, claiming that. When I see that sentence like that, I know that that's the writer of that paragraph stopping to explain why information is relevant, or they're making connections between ideas and sources in their paper, and they're somehow connecting all this back to their thesis statement. So when I see that, that obviously doesn't need to be cited because that's the writer of this paragraph's voice and ideas. Michael Lowry, for example, argues, And when I see this is a signal phrase, and it lets me know that information is coming from a source by Michael Lowry, or at least he's being quoted anyway. This is actually a paraphrase though, because I don't see quotation marks in any way. So this is a summary or a paraphrase. But then immediately following that, I see he explains, and then I see quotation marks, so I know I have a direct word-for-word quote from him there. Next, in the yellow there, I see many involved with the earlier civil rights movement concur, stating that Mary Jones simply doesn't understand the connection between poverty and racial injustice. This last sentence here would be the writer of this paragraph making connections between ideas in the paper and explaining the relevance of what they just showed us from all these sources. So, this is very important. So, if you look at the difference between this and this, there's a huge difference, because these qualifiers and signal phrases allow us to understand as readers where information is coming from. Now, ultimately, all this stuff has to be quoted, though. So what you'll see here is short quotes with page numbers. And a short quote is anything less than 4 lines. So everything that I have here is a short quote. So if you recall, the rule for citing a source is that you must cite immediately following a direct quote, and you must cite at the end of a paraphrase or a summary. So when I see Mary Jones explains that and have something inside quotation marks, I know that I must immediately cite it, which is why you see the 13 in parentheses there. And what that means is that information that's inside the quotation marks came from page 13 of Mary Jones's source. But then when I see she points out, she argues, she relates, and then she argues, and I don't see quotation marks, I know that all that's either summary or it's paraphrase. So I must also cite that. And so since I've given a signal phrase that gives me a very specific name, I can just list the page number there since I know it. Now, if I wouldn't know a page number, I didn't know a page number, then I would have to list Jones there inside of that citation instead of the page number, though. Keep that in mind. So this is how you cite a short quote. And then you'll see the same thing down below, but let me also back up a minute and say, when you see she points out, she relates, she argues, the citation is only at the end of the paraphrase. That's the rule. You cite where a paraphrase or a summary ends, not at the end of each one of those sentences. Like, not at the end of she points out and not at the end of she relates. That's not necessary. You only cite at where the paraphrase ends after she argues. And I know it ends there because then I see many social scientists, however, disagree. So I know that that's the writer of this paragraph using their own academic voice to explain connections or relevance there. And then you'll see Michael Lowry, for example, argues. So after that, I know I don't have a direct quote, so the paraphrase ends there, so I need to give the citation. So I have the 78 there. And then I see he explains inside of quotation marks, so I know I have a direct quotation. So the rule is you must cite after every direct quote. So again, if you have a source without page numbers, then you have to give us the author's name, even though you've mentioned it in the beginning there also. There's just no other way around that. You have to do that there. But see, with Lowry here, I didn't know my page numbers, so I can give them. So that concludes this brief mini lecture about qualifiers. We'll go over this again in class, and we're going to do exercises to help you understand it more. But at this point, I'm imagining you probably don't completely grasp the concept, so it's probably going to be a good idea for you to watch this video several times. And if you have questions, be sure that you mention those to me in class or by email, by Facebook, by Twitter. Just be sure that you get in touch with me and let me know what those questions are.